Daniel Whitmore grabbed the divorce papers and hurled them across the conference table directly at his wife's face. Claire barely flinched. He jabbed his finger at her, his voice dropping to something cold and deliberate. "You think you're something special. You're nobody. You've always been nobody." He snatched the pen, scrawled his signature with savage satisfaction, and shoved the papers back at her, hard enough to scatter them across the floor. "Pick them up," he said. "Then get out of my life." He was laughing before she even reached down. He had no idea. He had just signed away everything he would ever own. If you're new here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The morning Daniel Whitmore decided to end his marriage, he woke up in a good mood for the first time in months. He lay in the king-sized bed of his Gold Coast penthouse, staring at the ceiling with his arms behind his head, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt light, like a decision had already been made deep in his chest, and his body was just catching up to what his mind had known for weeks. He reached over to the nightstand without looking, and picked up his phone. There was a message from Victoria Hayes waiting for him, sent at 6:43 in the morning, which meant she had been awake thinking about him before the sun was fully up. "Breakfast at the Peninsula. I have news about the Meridian Group. You're going to want to hear this in person." He smiled before he even got out of bed. He showered, dressed in the charcoal suit he reserved for important meetings, and was out the door by 7:15. He didn't leave a note. He didn't check whether Claire was awake. He didn't think about her at all until he was already in the elevator, and even then the thought of her lasted about 4 seconds before it dissolved into the morning traffic noise rising up from Michigan Avenue below. That was the thing about Daniel Whitmore. He didn't think about Claire very often anymore. He used to, in the beginning. In the beginning, she had occupied a corner of his mind, the way a warm light occupies a room, quietly, steadily, always there. But somewhere in the past 2 years, that light had just gone out, or maybe he had just stopped noticing it. He wasn't sure which one it was, and he had long since stopped caring enough to figure it out. Victoria was already at the table when he arrived. She was wearing a cream blouse and her dark hair was down, and she looked exactly like the kind of woman people turned to look at twice when she walked into a room. She stood when she saw him, and she touched his arm the way she always did, and he felt that familiar electric charge run up through his sleeve. "You look pleased with yourself," she said. "I made a decision," he said, sitting down across from her. About everything," he said. "About my marriage, about what I want my life to look like in 5 years. He picked up the menu, even though he always ordered the same thing. "I'm done, Victoria. I've been done for a while. I'm just finally doing something about it." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She had learned to be careful around him when he was in a declarative mood. She had also learned that when Daniel said he was done, he meant it, and that pushing back too hard would only make him defensive. "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" she asked. "I called Marcus Fenn last night. We're meeting this afternoon." He set the menu down. "I want it handled quickly, clean. I don't want a war, I just want out." "What does Claire know?" He shrugged. "Nothing yet. She'll figure it out when the papers arrive." Victoria looked at him steadily. "Daniel, you've been married to this woman for 7 years. Don't you think she deserves a conversation?" "Claire doesn't want drama," he said. "Trust me, she'll be relieved. She's been just as checked out as I have." He reached for his coffee. "She's always been more interested in her books and her walks and her little charity projects than in anything I was building. We want completely different things. This is the right call for both of us." He believed every word of it. That was what made it so devastating later. Not that he lied, but that he genuinely believed he was doing the rational thing, that Claire would understand, that she would accept it quietly, that she would fold like she always folded. Because in 7 years of marriage, that was the pattern he had learned. Daniel would push, Claire would yield, Daniel would raise his voice, Claire would go quiet, Daniel would make decisions without consulting her, Claire would adapt. He had mistaken her patience for passivity. He had mistaken her silence for surrender. He had mistaken her gentleness for weakness, and in doing so, he had made the most catastrophic error of his adult life, and he was going to spend the next several months discovering exactly how catastrophic it was. But on that Tuesday morning in October, sitting across from Victoria Hayes at the Peninsula Hotel, drinking his coffee, and feeling lighter than he had in years, Daniel Whitmore had no idea. He felt like a man who had just set himself free. Claire was still home when the courier delivered the letter from Marcus Fenn's office. She was in the kitchen making tea when she heard the buzzer from the lobby. She went downstairs herself. She always did that, always preferred to take things personally rather than leave them at the door, and signed for the envelope with her own hand. She carried it back up to the kitchen and set it on the table. She already knew what it was. She had known something was coming for weeks. Not because Daniel had said anything. He hadn't said anything. But she had felt the temperature change in the apartment the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds actually arrive. The air gets different. The light gets different. You just know. She made her tea first. She set the kettle down and she pulled out the chair and she sat down. Then she opened the envelope. She read through the petition for dissolution of marriage slowly. She read every paragraph, every numbered clause, every date and figure and legal formality. When she was done, she folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the envelope. Then she sat with her tea, and she looked out the kitchen window for a long time. The Chicago skyline was gray that morning. A plane was blinking its way across the distance. A cloud was moving over the lake. She didn't cry. She thought about crying. She waited for it the way you wait for rain when the sky has already gone dark. But it didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and heavier, something that felt almost like recognition. She had known this was who he was. She had just hoped she was wrong. She picked up her phone and called the only person she ever called when things became serious. "Jonathan," she said when he answered. He filed. There was a pause. She could hear Jonathan Pierce exhale slowly on the other end of the line. "When did the papers arrive?" "Just now." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. And then, because Jonathan had known her since she was 11 years old and could tell the difference between fine and fine, she added, "I'm not surprised." "I know," he said. "I know you're not." Another pause. "What do you want to do?" She looked down at the envelope on the table. "I want to think for a few days. I'm not going to react. I'm not going to call him. I'm not going to call his attorney. I'm just going to sit with it." "That's smart," Jonathan said. And then she said, "When the time is right, I want you to start pulling everything together." Jonathan's voice shifted. It became the voice she trusted most in the world, calm and precise and completely without panic. "I'll start today," he said. "How much do you want me to reveal?" "Nothing yet," she said. "Let him believe what he believes. Let him feel like he's won." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "Claire." "Yes." "He doesn't know what's coming." "No," she said. She picked up her tea. "He doesn't." The divorce meeting was held 3 weeks later in Marcus Fenn's offices on the 42nd floor of a downtown tower. Claire came alone. No attorney, no advisor, no support. She wore a gray cardigan over a simple dark blouse, and her hair was pulled back the way she always wore it when she wasn't trying to impress anyone, which was most of the time. Daniel came with Marcus Fenn and his associate and Victoria, who was not a party to the proceedings, but whom Daniel had insisted on bringing because he wanted a witness, or because he wanted an audience, or because somewhere beneath all his confidence, there was still a small, frightened part of him that needed someone standing behind him when he did hard things. He saw Claire sitting at the conference table when he walked in, and he felt the smallest flicker of something he didn't want to name. He covered it immediately. "You didn't bring a lawyer," he said. She looked at him calmly. "I know what I'm agreeing to." He frowned. "Claire, you really should have." "Daniel," she said quietly, but with an edge that he had never quite heard in her voice before. "Let's just get through this." Marcus Fenn moved the proceedings along efficiently. He was a professional man who had facilitated many difficult conversations in this room and had learned to let the paperwork do most of the talking. He laid out the terms, the asset division, the property settlement, the agreement that Claire would receive a financial settlement that Daniel had clearly designed to be adequate without being generous. Claire listened to all of it without interrupting. Daniel watched her and felt a familiar irritation rising in his chest. She was so quiet. She was always so quiet. Even now, even in this moment, she sat there in her gray cardigan and her pulled-back hair, and she just listened like she was taking a class, like this was information she needed to file away somewhere, like she wasn't the one whose marriage was being dissolved line by line across a mahogany conference table. "Do you have any questions about the terms?" Marcus Fenn asked her. "No," she said. "You're satisfied with the settlement." She looked at Daniel when she answered. "I think what Daniel has offered reflects exactly what he believes I deserve," she said. "So yes, I'm satisfied." Something about the way she said it made Daniel shift in his chair. But Marcus Fenn was already moving toward the signature pages, and the moment passed. Daniel signed first. He picked up the pen and he signed with the quick, firm stroke of a man who had been waiting for this moment and was glad it was finally here. He slid the papers across to Claire. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked up at Daniel, and she held his gaze just long enough for him to feel something uncomfortable move through him, something he couldn't identify, and then she looked back down. She signed. Daniel exhaled. "Congratulations to both of you," Marcus Fenn said, because he always said that even though it was never quite the right word for moments like this one. Daniel stood and buttoned his jacket. "Well," he said, and he smiled at Claire with the kind of smile that carried decades of superiority in it. "This is probably the best thing for both of us. I hope you find whatever it is you were looking for, Claire. I really do." She looked up at him. "I already know what I'm looking for," she said. "I've always known." He didn't know what to do with that, so he laughed. Not the ugly laugh from the lobby that morning, a quieter one, a dismissive one, the kind of laugh that says, "I'm not taking you seriously enough to be offended." "Take care of yourself," he said. He picked up his briefcase. He turned toward Victoria and said something in a low voice that made her nod, and then the two of them walked out of the conference room together without looking back. Claire sat at the table for another moment after they left. Marcus Fenn was gathering papers. His associate was capping pens. Neither of them paid much attention to her. She reached into her bag and took out her phone and sent one text message. It went to Jonathan Pierce. It said, "It's done. Begin." She put her phone away. She picked up her bag. She stood up and thanked Marcus Fenn for his time, and she shook his hand, and she walked out of the building into the gray Chicago afternoon. She didn't look like a woman who had just lost. She walked like someone who had just made the opening move. She had been in Daniel Whitmore's life for 7 years. She had cooked in his kitchen and slept in his bed and attended his dinners and smiled at his clients. She had listened to him talk about his ambitions for hours and never once interrupted. She had swallowed her own opinions when they conflicted with his. She had worn simple clothes and driven a modest car and given people no reason to look twice at her. She had done all of this deliberately and completely, because the one thing Claire Bennett had learned from her grandmother, from the formidable, extraordinary woman who had built the Bennett Legacy Trust into one of the most quietly powerful financial structures in American history, was that real power never announces itself. Real power doesn't need to. Real power simply waits. It positions itself where it needs to be. It watches. It learns. And when the moment finally arrives, it moves. Her grandmother had told her that once when she was 14 years old, sitting in the study of the family's Connecticut estate, while the older woman moved pieces on a chessboard and didn't look up. "The loudest person in the room," her grandmother had said, "is almost never the most powerful one. Remember that." She had remembered. Daniel had married a woman he thought he understood. He had built a picture of Claire in his mind, quiet, simple content, slightly dull, and he had lived with that picture for 7 years and never once questioned it. He had never asked himself why a woman with her education, her composure, her instincts would be satisfied with a quiet life in his shadow. He had never wondered about the calls she took in private, the trips she made alone, the way Jonathan Pierce spoke to her like she was running something enormous. He had never asked because he didn't think there was anything worth asking about. That was the thing about arrogance. It doesn't just make you cruel, it makes you blind. In the weeks following the divorce, Daniel's life took on a quality that could only be described as triumphant. He moved Victoria into the penthouse within 10 days. He took meetings with the Meridian Group that he had been putting off for months. He attended events with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had just shed a weight he had been carrying for years and could now move freely in the world. His company, Whitmore Capital, had been facing a quiet pressure for several months. Some over-leveraged investments, some commitments that had grown tighter than expected, but Daniel had been managing it, reassuring his board, telling the people who needed to be told that everything was under control. He was good at that. He had always been good at projecting confidence, even when the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He told himself the restructuring would come. He told himself the Meridian deal would stabilize everything. He told himself it was just a moment, just a cycle, just the natural turbulence of any ambitious enterprise. He did not tell himself that Claire Bennett had anything to do with any of it, because how could she? She was nobody. She was a woman in a gray cardigan who had signed divorce papers without a lawyer and taken a modest settlement and disappeared from his life as quietly as she had lived in it. She was gone. That's what he told himself every morning when he woke up in the penthouse with Victoria beside him. She was gone and he had won, and now everything could finally begin. Meanwhile, in a building 37 blocks north in an office that most of Chicago didn't know existed, Jonathan Pierce was doing exactly what Claire had asked him to do. He was beginning. Jonathan Pierce was 62 years old and had spent 4 decades as the chief financial strategist of the Bennett Legacy Trust. He had outlasted 3 chairmen, 2 recessions, a market collapse, and 1 attempt by a rival family to absorb the trust through a series of hostile maneuvers that had become something of a legend in certain very quiet rooms. He was not a man who used many words when a few would do, and he was not a man who made mistakes he hadn't already accounted for. He had watched Claire grow up. He had watched her grandmother teach her, test her, challenge her, hold her to a standard that most people never even aspired to. He had been present at the reading of the trust documents when Claire turned 30, and he had seen the expression on her face when the full scope of what she was inheriting was laid out before her. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet settling, like a door closing softly on one life and opening onto another. He had also been watching Daniel Whitmore for 7 years. He hadn't liked what he saw. Not because Daniel was cruel, though he was, in the low-grade self-serving way that certain successful men are cruel without fully realizing it, but because Daniel was reckless in ways that Claire had tried to manage, and Daniel had refused to acknowledge, because the financial architecture of Whitmore Capital had more holes in it than Daniel understood, because the decisions Daniel made in private were exactly the kind of decisions that eventually became very public problems. Jonathan had raised concerns with Claire twice over the years. She had heard him. She always heard him, but she was in her own patient way still hoping, still watching to see if Daniel could become the man she had believed he might be when she married him. He hadn't become that man. And now, as Jonathan sat in his quiet North Side office, surrounded by documents and financial analyses and a carefully constructed series of communications with the Bennett Trust's legal team, he felt not satisfaction exactly, but something resolved, like a chord that had been hovering unfinished for years had finally come to rest. He pulled up the file on a company called Arkbridge Investment Partners. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a series of very precise calls. By the end of that week, Arkbridge Investment Partners had made its first quiet move toward Whitmore Capital. Daniel didn't notice. He was having dinner with Victoria at a restaurant where the chef had 3 Michelin stars and a 3-month waiting list, celebrating a preliminary agreement with the Meridian Group that he believed was going to change everything. He ordered champagne. He clinked glasses with Victoria. He felt for the first time in a long time like the story of his life was going exactly the way he had always intended. At the same moment, in a much quieter restaurant on the north side of the city, Claire Bennett was having dinner alone with a book propped open beside her water glass, and she was not celebrating anything because she didn't need to celebrate. She was simply moving forward. She had decided something in that conference room on the day she signed the divorce papers. She had decided that she was done accommodating, done being the smaller version of herself so that Daniel could feel like the larger version of himself, done wearing gray cardigans and pulling her hair back and letting people see exactly as much of her as they expected to see. The woman who walked out of Marcus Fenn's office that afternoon had made a decision not to destroy Daniel Whitmore. That was important. She had no interest in destruction. Her grandmother had taught her that too. Revenge is a small ambition, she had said. Justice is what you build when you understand the difference. She wanted justice. For herself. For the employees at Whitmore Capital who were working for a company that was being badly managed. For the investors who trusted their capital to a man who was running on ego and borrowed time. She wanted clarity. She wanted accountability. She wanted the world to see the difference between what Daniel Whitmore had presented himself to be and what he actually was. And she wanted something for herself too. Something she hadn't allowed herself to want for a very long time. She wanted to be seen, not for her family's money, not for her grandmother's legacy, not for any of the titles and structures and inherited power that she had been deliberately keeping invisible all her adult life. She wanted to be seen for who she was, for the choices she made, for the work she did, for the kind of person she had always been, even when she was sitting quietly in the background and letting someone else believe they were the protagonist of the story. She turned a page of her book. She was 36 years old. She had been patient long enough. Outside Chicago moved through its October evening, the lake wind picking up from the east, the traffic on Michigan Avenue thinning out the lights of the skyline, beginning to assert themselves against the darkening sky. Inside a restaurant with 3 Michelin stars, Daniel Whitmore was ordering a second bottle of champagne. Inside a quieter place, Claire Bennett was reading. Both of them were getting ready. Only one of them knew for what. She set her book down for a moment and looked out the window at the street. A couple walked past with a dog. A taxi slowed at the corner and moved on. An old man in a heavy coat stood at a bus stop, looking at something on his phone. Ordinary people living ordinary Tuesday evenings. She had always loved that about the city, the way it just kept moving, the way it didn't stop to assess whether you were important enough to deserve its attention. It just moved and you moved with it, and if you were paying attention, you could feel something enormous and indifferent and magnificent humming underneath all of it. She had a lot of work to do. She reached for her water glass, and in the window's reflection, she could see herself, just her face, just the line of her jaw and her steady eyes and the slight set of her mouth that people who knew her well could read as absolute, irreversible determination. She looked at her own reflection for one moment. Then she looked back at her book. It was time. The text message Claire sent to Jonathan Pierce that afternoon, 2 words, "It's done," set into motion something that Daniel Whitmore would not see coming for months, and that was entirely by design. Jonathan received the message while sitting in a meeting with 3 members of the Bennett Trust's legal advisory board. He excused himself without explanation, stepped into the hallway, and called Claire back within 30 seconds. "Are you all right?" he asked first. He always asked that first. "I'm better than all right," she said. "I'm clear." "Then we move." "We move," she confirmed. He went back into the meeting room and he said 4 words to the 3 people sitting around the table. He said, "It's time. Begin Arkbridge." Nobody asked any questions. They had been waiting for those words for 8 months. Within 48 hours, Arkbridge Investment Partners, a privately held entity with no public footprint, no press coverage, and no connection in any visible document to the name. Bennett began making its first strategic inquiries into the financial architecture of Whitmore Capital. Daniel, meanwhile, was having the best week of his professional life, or so he believed. The preliminary agreement with the Meridian Group had generated exactly the kind of internal momentum he had been trying to build for months. His board was cautiously optimistic. His senior team was energized. Victoria had attended 2 of his client dinners and performed exactly the role he had hoped she would: polished, impressive, socially fluent, in a way that Claire had never been, or so he told himself, because it was easier than admitting that Claire had simply chosen not to perform. "You seem different," his operations director Marcus Webb told him one morning in the elevator. "Lighter." "I am lighter," Daniel said. "I made some changes." Marcus nodded carefully. He had worked with Daniel for 6 years and had learned to read the spaces between his words. He didn't ask what changes. He filed the observation away. What Marcus Webb knew, and what Daniel did not know he knew, was that 3 of Whitmore Capital's largest institutional partners had been quietly asking questions for the past several weeks. Not alarming questions, not the kind of questions that got escalated immediately, just questions, small ones. The kind that sophisticated investors ask when they sense something shifting beneath the surface of a company they have trusted with significant capital. Marcus had mentioned this to Daniel twice. Both times Daniel had waved it off. "Routine due diligence," he had said. "They do this every cycle." Marcus had not pushed, but he had started keeping a private file. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Claire met Jonathan for lunch at a small Italian restaurant on the North Side that they had been going to together for 15 years. The owner knew them. He brought bread without being asked and left them alone without being told to. "Talk to me about Whitmore Capital," Claire said before she had even opened her menu. Jonathan set his water glass down. "The leverage position is worse than we initially assessed. He took on 2 bridge loans in September that his board doesn't fully understand the terms of. The Meridian deal is real, but it won't close fast enough to cover the gap." "How long does he have?" "At current burn rate, 6 to 8 months before the pressure becomes public." Claire looked at the bread basket. She pulled a piece off and set it on her plate without eating it. "What about the employees?" "About 240 people on direct payroll, another 60 or so in contract roles. Most of them have no idea." "And the investors?" 12 institutional partners. 3 of them are already nervous. The others will follow once the nervous ones start talking. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to protect the employees. That's the first priority. Whatever restructuring happens, those 240 people do not lose their livelihoods because Daniel made bad decisions. Jonathan nodded. He had expected her to say that. Arkbridge can position as a white knight, come in as stabilizing capital, negotiate protective covenants for the workforce as part of the restructuring terms. Yes, she said, exactly that. Daniel will resist. Of course he will. She finally picked up her piece of bread. He'll resist until he doesn't have a choice. Jonathan watched her for a moment. You know he's going to figure out eventually that Arkbridge is connected to you. Yes, she said, and you're comfortable with that. She met his eyes. Jonathan. The question was never whether he would find out. The question was always when and under what circumstances and who was in the room when it happened. He smiled at that, just slightly. The smile of a man who had been watching someone become exactly who they were supposed to be. You sound like your grandmother, he said. She looked at him steadily. Good, she said. Daniel found out about Arkbridge on a Thursday morning in November, 6 weeks after the divorce papers were signed. I was in his corner office when his CFO, a precise and perpetually anxious man named Robert Chow, knocked twice and entered without waiting for an answer, which was how Daniel knew immediately that something had gone sideways. What? Daniel said. Robert closed the door. We received a formal inquiry this morning from an entity called Arkbridge Investment Partners. They're expressing interest in a significant equity stake in the company. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Who are they? That's what I've been trying to figure out since 7 this morning. They're private. Very private. The public filing trail is clean but minimal. They have significant assets under management. We're talking institutional scale, but they've operated completely below the radar. What kind of stake are they talking about? Robert hesitated. Controlling. Daniel sat forward. Excuse me. They want a controlling stake, Daniel, with full board representation and restructuring authority. The room was very quiet for a moment. That's a hostile play, Daniel said. It could be framed as a rescue, Robert said carefully, given our current liquidity position. Our liquidity position is fine, Robert. Robert looked at him with the expression of a man who has had this exact conversation before and lost it before and is about to lose it again. Daniel, the Meridian deal hasn't closed yet. The September bridge loans are going to start generating covenant pressure by February. If 3 of our institutional partners ask for redemption at the same time, they won't. They might. Robert. They might. Robert's voice was steady. And if they do, we need a capital solution in place before that happens. Arkbridge is offering that solution. Daniel stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the city for a moment. When he turned back, his face had the controlled expression he wore when he was genuinely rattled but refused to show it. Find out who's behind Arkbridge, he said. I want a name, a real name, not a corporate structure. We're working on it. Work faster. Robert left. Daniel stood at the window for a long time after that. Something was wrong. He could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, not a specific data point, just a shift in atmospheric pressure that your body registers before your mind catches up. He picked up his phone and called Victoria. I need you to ask around about something, he said when she answered. Quietly, an investment firm called Arkbridge Partners. I need to know who the principals are. Why? She asked. Because they're circling my company, and I don't know who they are, and I don't like things I don't know. I'll make some calls, she said. He hung up and stared at the city, and tried to remember if he had ever heard the name Arkbridge before. He was almost certain he hadn't. He was also almost certain that that certainty was wrong. It took Victoria 4 days to come back with anything meaningful, and when she did, the information she had was incomplete in a way that bothered her more than the information itself. I can't get a principal name, she told him over dinner. I've talked to 5 people who should know, and nobody has a clean answer. The entity is structured through 3 layers of holding companies. The money is real. My contact at First Meridian says they've seen Arkbridge move serious capital, but the beneficial owner is completely obscured. That's not normal, Daniel said. No, she agreed. It's not. He put down his fork. Someone is hiding. Or someone is being very careful, she said, which in my experience amounts to the same thing. He looked at her. Could it be a competitor, someone trying to use the acquisition route because they can't compete directly? Possible, but the capital structure is wrong for that. The competitors I'm thinking of don't have this kind of liquidity. Then who? Victoria was quiet for a moment. She turned her wine glass slowly in her fingers. Daniel, she said, I keep coming back to one question, and I need you to hear it without reacting. Go ahead. Is there anyone from your personal life, someone with resources you may have underestimated, who would have a reason to do this? He stared at her. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a strategic question. Victoria, think about it seriously, she said, before you dismiss it. He started to say something sharp, and then something stopped him. A flicker. A memory. The conference room. Claire sitting across the table in her gray cardigan, her voice completely calm. I already know what I'm looking for. I've always known. He pushed it away. No, he said. There's no one. But that night, lying awake while Victoria slept beside him, the flicker came back. He stared at the ceiling and he turned it over, and he thought about 7 years of things he hadn't looked at closely enough, and he told himself he was being paranoid, that Claire was nobody, that she had walked out of that conference room with a modest settlement and a quiet life waiting for her somewhere, and that the idea that she was connected to any of this was exactly the kind of magical thinking that men did when they felt cornered and needed someone to blame. He told himself that for about an hour. Then he got up, went to his home office, and began trying to trace Arkbridge himself. He got nowhere. At the same moment, 3 floors below the ground level of an office building that did not have its name on the exterior, Claire was reviewing documents with Jonathan and 2 members of the legal team. She had been at this for 3 hours. She showed no signs of fatigue. They're tracing Arkbridge, Jonathan said, setting down a printed report. Our monitoring caught 3 separate inquiry chains in the last 72 hours. One of them traces back to Daniel's CFO. One traces back to a contact at First Meridian that I believe is connected to Victoria Hayes. And the third, Claire asked, Daniel himself. She looked up from the document she was reading. He's up at night doing his own research, Jonathan said, which tells us the pressure is working. It's not supposed to be pressure, she said quietly. It's supposed to be a mirror. Claire, I mean it, Jonathan. I don't want to hurt him. I want him to see clearly. She set the document down. Is the Arkbridge proposal ready to formalize? Yes. Then let's send it. Full documentation, complete terms, including the workforce protection covenants. If he sees those covenants, he'll know something is different. A purely financial entity doesn't negotiate workforce protections as a primary term. I know, she said. Jonathan looked at her carefully. You want him to start wondering. I want him to start thinking, she said. There's a difference. She stood up and walked to the window, not to look at anything specific, just to move, just to let the room breathe. When he signed those papers, she said, he thought he was closing a door. He thought he was walking away clean. She turned back to Jonathan. He didn't walk away from anything. He just stopped paying attention. And there's a very big difference between those 2 things. Jonathan nodded slowly. When do you want the first direct contact with Whitmore Capital? 2 weeks, she said. Let them sit with the proposal for 2 weeks. Let Robert Chow read those terms 40 times and ask questions that Daniel refuses to answer. And then we'll send someone for the first meeting. Who? She smiled. Not a cold smile, not a triumphant one. Something quieter than either. Not me, not yet. Someone who will make Daniel feel like he's still in control. That's going to make the moment when he realizes he isn't significantly more dramatic. Yes, she said. It is. 2 weeks later, Robert Chow sat across from Arkbridge's lead representative, a composed woman named Sylvia Park, who had been with the Bennett Trust's advisory network for 11 years, and who had a gift for making people feel simultaneously respected and deeply, completely outmaneuvered. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Robert walked out of it and went directly to Daniel's office and closed the door behind him and said, "We need to talk about Arkbridge." Daniel looked up from his desk. What happened? Their terms are not what I expected. Robert sat down without being asked. The financial structure is actually very favorable, better than what we'd get from a traditional restructuring lender. The interest terms are reasonable. The equity conversion schedule is manageable. He paused. But the conditions attached to the workforce protections are unlike anything I've seen in a purely financial deal. What do you mean? They want guaranteed employment security for all 240 direct employees for a minimum of 3 years following any restructuring. They want independent oversight of senior compensation decisions. They want a community impact clause that requires any operational changes to consider, and I'm quoting directly, the well-being of employees and their families as a primary operational value. Robert looked at Daniel over his glasses. That's not language that comes from a financial firm. Daniel was very still. What is it language that comes from someone who cares about the people who work here, someone for whom this isn't just a capital allocation exercise? The room was quiet. Robert, Daniel said, his voice careful, in your professional opinion, based on 20 years of doing this, who puts terms like that in an acquisition proposal? Robert looked at him steadily. Someone who knows the company from the inside, someone who has had a reason at some point to care about the people who work here, someone who is not primarily motivated by financial return. Daniel felt the blood leave his face. He stood up. He walked to the window again. He did that more and more lately, walked to the window, looked out at the city, tried to find his footing in the view. Schedule a meeting with their principal, he said, his voice not quite steady. The actual principal, not a representative. I want to sit across from whoever is behind Arkbridge, and I want to look them in the eye. Robert stood. I'll reach out today. Robert? Yes. Don't tell Victoria about this conversation. Robert paused at the door. He looked back at Daniel with an expression that was careful and unreadable. Of course, he said. He left. And Daniel stood in the window and did the thing he had been refusing to do for 6 weeks. He thought about Claire, really thought about her. Not the story of her he had been telling himself for 7 years, but the actual woman, the actual details, the things he had noticed and then not noticed, the calls she took in private, the way Jonathan Pierce spoke to her, the trips she took twice a year to Connecticut that she never fully explained and he never fully questioned. He thought about the settlement she had accepted without negotiating, about the fact that she came to the conference room without a lawyer, about the way she had looked at him when she signed, not with anger, not with grief, but with something that looked almost like patience, like someone who has already played their move and is simply waiting for the board to reflect it. No, he said out loud, but even as he said it, something in his chest was telling him he was wrong. He picked up his phone. He called a man named Gerald Hess, who had been a private investigator for 20 years and who Daniel had used twice before for background checks on business partners. I need you to look into someone, he said when Gerald answered. Someone I thought I knew. Name Claire Bennett, he said. My ex-wife. What are you looking for? Anything I missed, he said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what kind of time frame are we working with? As fast as possible, Daniel said. Whatever it costs. He hung up and sat back down at his desk and tried to focus on his emails and couldn't. The thing in his chest wouldn't settle. It kept pulling at him, that image. Claire in her gray cardigan signing those papers without a lawyer, without a flinch, looking up at him at the end with those calm eyes and saying, I already know what I'm looking for. I've always known. He had laughed at her. He had actually laughed. 3 days later, Gerald Hess called him back. He called at 8 in the morning, which was early even for Gerald, and his voice had the particular quality that it got when he was delivering something significant and was trying to stay professionally neutral about it. I have some information for you, Gerald said. Go ahead. Your ex-wife, Claire Elizabeth Bennett, age 36, born in Greenwich, Connecticut. Parents deceased both in a car accident when she was 9, raised primarily by her maternal grandmother. A pause. Her grandmother's name is Eleanor Catherine Bennett. Okay, Daniel said. Does the name Bennett Legacy Trust mean anything to you? The silence that followed lasted a long time. Say that again, Daniel said. Bennett Legacy Trust, Gerald repeated. It's a private financial structure, not publicly traded, barely any public footprint, but our financial people estimate assets in the range of multiple trillions. It's one of the largest private wealth structures in American history. Eleanor Bennett controls it, or controlled it until about 4 years ago when she transferred primary authority to her granddaughter. Another pause. To Claire. Daniel's hand holding the phone was not steady. You're telling me, he said slowly, that Claire Bennett, my wife, your ex-wife, Gerald said. My ex-wife is she controls. The full scope of the trust's assets and operational authority passed to Claire Bennett upon her 30th birthday, in accordance with terms set by Eleanor Bennett decades ago. She is the sole principal beneficiary and operational successor. Gerald's voice was very careful. In practical terms, Daniel, your ex-wife, is one of the wealthiest private individuals in the United States, possibly in the world. The phone almost slipped from Daniel's hand. He gripped it tighter. An Arkbridge, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. I'm still working on confirming that directly, Gerald said, but the ownership chain traces through Connecticut. The legal structures are consistent with what I'd expect from the trust's operating methodology. I think it's a near certainty. Daniel set the phone down on his desk without hanging up. He sat very still. I thought about 7 years. 7 years of a woman who made her own tea and drove her own car and wore gray cardigans and never asked for anything and never pushed for anything and never told him anything that would have changed a single decision he made. And he had looked at all of that and seen ordinary. He had looked at all of that and seen nothing. He had signed those papers. He had laughed when he signed them. He had pushed the papers across the table and told her to get out of his life, and she had looked at him with those patient, steady eyes, and she had signed, and she had walked out of that conference room, and the first thing she had done was call the man who managed the operations of one of the most powerful private financial structures in the country. And that man had begun. Daniel Whitmore picked up the phone again. Gerald, he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, flat and far away. Still here, Gerald said. Is there anything else I should know? Gerald hesitated. There's one more thing. When I was pulling public records, very limited, but some, I found a quote attributed to Eleanor Bennett from a business publication interview about 12 years ago. He read it slowly. She said, "The most dangerous person in any room is the one who has nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Most people never recognize them because they're looking for the performance." End quote. Daniel said nothing. I thought you'd want to know, Gerald said. Yes, Daniel said. Thank you. He ended the call. He sat in his corner office on the 38th floor of his downtown tower, and he looked at the city, and he thought about the woman he had spent 7 years dismissing, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Daniel Whitmore felt something he almost never felt. He felt genuinely afraid, not of Claire, not of the money or the trust or the legal implications of what Arkbridge was positioned to do to his company. I was afraid of the thing Gerald had just confirmed, the thing he had been circling for weeks without being able to land on it. He was afraid that he had never, not once, actually seen the person he was married to, and that the person he had failed to see had been watching him very clearly the entire time. He picked up his phone again. His thumb moved to Victoria's name. He stopped. He set the phone face down. He sat alone in his office with the city outside and the quiet inside and the feeling of a man who has just realized too late that the game he thought he was winning was never actually the game being played. Somewhere across the city, Claire Bennett was in a meeting, a real one, the kind she had been running for 4 years without anyone in Daniel's world knowing it existed. She was at the head of a table, not the side of one, and the people around her were some of the sharpest financial and legal minds she had assembled over the course of a decade, and she was talking about the future of Whitmore Capital's employees with the focused precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and exactly what she intended to do about it. Her phone was face down. She would look at it later. There was work to do first. Gerald Hess's report sat on Daniel's desk for 2 days before he told anyone about it. He didn't tell Victoria. He didn't tell Robert. He didn't tell Marcus Webb or his attorney or anyone on his board. He read it 3 times, put it in his desk drawer, locked the drawer, and went about his week. The way a man goes about his week when he is carrying something so heavy that putting it down even for a moment might make it impossible to pick back up. He slept badly. He ate without tasting anything. He sat in meetings and heard the words people were saying and processed none of them. He kept returning over and over to the same sequence of memories, playing them back in the same order, looking for the thing he had missed, the moment he should have seen it, the crack in the surface where the truth had been visible all along, and he had simply looked away. Claire making tea in the morning. Claire reading in the chair by the window. Claire on the phone in the hallway, her voice low, and when he had asked who it was, she had said, "Jonathan, business matters." And he had nodded and gone back to whatever he was doing, because he had never thought to ask what business, what matters, whose business, how large. He had never asked because he had never believed she had anything worth asking about. Victoria noticed the change in him before the end of the first day. She was perceptive that way. She had built her professional reputation on reading rooms and reading people, and she read Daniel the way she read everything quickly and with high accuracy. She knew something had shifted. She didn't know what. "You're somewhere else," she told him Tuesday evening. "I'm tired," he said. "You're not tired. You're thinking about something you haven't told me." He looked at her across the dinner table, and for a moment he almost said it. He almost told her everything. But something stopped him. Something that felt like shame and tasted like fear, and he swallowed both of them and said, "It's just the Arkbridge thing. I'm trying to work through it." "Have you heard back about the principal meeting?" "Not yet." Victoria set her fork down. "Daniel, I've been making more calls. About Arkbridge. About the ownership trail." His chest tightened. "And every path I follow goes through Connecticut, and every path through Connecticut eventually hits a wall that's not accidental." She met his eyes. "Someone with very serious resources built that wall very deliberately. I've never seen anything like it." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying whoever is behind Arkbridge is not a financial entity in the traditional sense. They're not doing this for return on investment." She paused. "They're doing this for a reason." He picked up his wine glass and took a long drink and said nothing. "Daniel," she said, "I need you to be honest with me." "I'm always honest with you. Is there anything about Claire's background that you didn't fully investigate before you married her?" The wine glass stopped halfway back to the table. He set it down very carefully. "What made you think of Claire?" he asked, and his voice was 1 degree too controlled. Victoria watched him for a long moment. "Because the workforce protection language in the Arkbridge proposal reads like someone who spent significant time inside your company without anyone knowing they were paying attention, and the only person in your life who fits that description who would also have reason to—" She stopped. "Tell me I'm wrong." He didn't tell her she was wrong. The silence between them stretched out long enough to become its own kind of answer. Victoria pushed back from the table. She stood up. "How long have you known?" "A few days," he said. "And you didn't tell me." "I was still processing it." "Processing it." Her voice had gone flat. "Your ex-wife is apparently controlling one of the largest private financial structures in the country. She has positioned a holding entity to acquire your company, and you have been sitting across from me for 3 days and processing it." "Victoria, do not." She held up one hand. "Do not try to manage me right now. I am trying to understand what you knew and when you knew it, and how it is possible that in 7 years of marriage you never once thought to look closely at who you were actually living with." "I didn't know," he said. "That's worse," she said. "That is significantly worse." She picked up her bag. She walked out of the dining room. He heard the front door close behind her. He sat alone at the table for a long time after that. He wasn't angry at Victoria for leaving. He couldn't be. She was right, every word of it. How was the one who had been looking without seeing for 7 years? He was the one who had sat across from a woman of extraordinary depth and intelligence and power, and had decided based on what she wore and how she spoke, and how quietly she moved through the world, that she was ordinary. He had done that. He had made that choice thousands of times, in thousands of small moments, and now the sum of all those choices was sitting on his desk in a locked drawer in the form of a private investigator's report. He picked up his phone. He stared at it. He thought about calling Claire. He put the phone face down. He wasn't ready. He didn't know what ready would feel like. He wasn't sure it was a state he was going to be able to reach on his own. 3 days later, Robert Chow told him the Arkbridge principal was ready to meet. "When?" Daniel asked. "They're proposing Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock. Robert slid a card across the desk. "Neutral location. Their legal team selected a conference suite at the Langham." Daniel looked at the card. "Did they give a name for the principal?" "The meeting is being convened by a man named Jonathan Pierce. He's listed as chief financial strategist for the beneficial interest holder." Robert paused. "Do you know that name?" Daniel looked at the card for a long time. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know that name." Robert waited. "Set the meeting," Daniel said. "Friday at 4. Robert nodded and left. Daniel sat with the card in his hand and thought about Jonathan Pierce. He was trying to remember every interaction he had witnessed between Jonathan and Claire over the years. There hadn't been many. Jonathan had come to the apartment twice, maybe 3 times, and both visits had been brief, and Daniel had been present for parts of them without paying attention. He remembered a tall, composed older man. He remembered Claire's posture changing when Jonathan walked in, not nervous, but alert, more precise, like a different register of herself had been engaged. He remembered one moment specifically. He had walked into the kitchen, and Jonathan and Claire had been at the table with papers between them, and when he walked in, they had both looked up, and Jonathan had said completely calmly, "Daniel, good to see you." And Claire had slid the papers into a folder without hurrying, without hiding anything, just naturally, like someone who carries the habit of discretion so deeply that it doesn't even look like discretion anymore. He had said hello and poured himself a glass of water and left. He hadn't asked what the papers were. He had never asked. Friday arrived, and Daniel spent the morning trying to prepare for a meeting he didn't know how to prepare for. He had his attorney pull everything publicly available on Jonathan Pierce, which was not much, and what there was confirmed what Gerald Hess had already outlined. 4 decades in private financial management, no public profile, an almost complete absence from any document that wasn't strictly necessary for his professional function. A man who had spent his career being exactly as visible as he needed to be, and not 1 degree more. Like the woman he served, Daniel put on his best suit. He told his assistant he had an external meeting and gave no further details. He did not tell Victoria where he was going. He took a car alone. He arrived at the Langham at 3:55. He was shown to a conference suite on the 14th floor. The room was quietly appointed neutral and comfortable in the specific way that expensive neutral rooms are when someone has paid significant attention to every detail without wanting those details to be noticed. Jonathan Pierce was already there. He stood when Daniel walked in, and he extended his hand and he said, "Daniel, thank you for coming." I was exactly as Daniel remembered. Tall, composed, the kind of stillness that comes from decades of being the person in the room who is never the one who needs to fill silence. "Jonathan," Daniel said. He shook the hand. He sat down. There were 2 attorneys on Jonathan's side of the table. Daniel had brought his own attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Wells, who had been briefed as much as Daniel could brief her, given that he had withheld half of what he knew. Jonathan opened a folder. "I appreciate your willingness to meet directly. I know the Arkbridge proposal has raised questions, and I'd rather answer them in person than through correspondence." "I have one question," Daniel said, "before we go through any of it." Jonathan looked at him. "Go ahead. Is Claire Bennett the beneficial owner of Arkbridge?" Jonathan did not look away. He did not hesitate. He simply said, "That question will be answered fully at the appropriate time. What I can tell you today is that the beneficial interest holder is someone with deep knowledge of your company, genuine concern for your employees, and a strong interest in ensuring this restructuring is handled with integrity." "That's not an answer. It's the answer available today," Jonathan said, his voice completely even. "I'd suggest focusing on the terms, because the terms are what will determine the future of your company and the livelihoods of the people who work there." Patricia Wells touched Daniel's arm lightly. He sat back. They went through the terms, and the terms were remarkable. Patricia made a note every 30 seconds. The financial structure was not punitive. The equity conversion was genuinely reasonable. The interest rates were below market. The timeline for restructuring was achievable. And threaded through every section carefully and precisely were the workforce protections, not as afterthoughts, not as negotiating chips, as primary conditions, as the thing around which everything else was built. 240 people, 3 years of guaranteed employment, independent oversight, a community impact clause with actual teeth. 40 minutes into the meeting, Patricia leaned close to Daniel and said quietly, "This is the most employee-protective acquisition structure I have ever seen. Whoever designed this is not thinking about return on investment." Daniel said nothing. Jonathan was watching him from across the table with the calm attention of a man who has done this many times and knows exactly how it goes. "I want to ask you something," Daniel said, suddenly cutting across something one of Jonathan's attorneys was explaining. Jonathan nodded. "Of course. The person behind this, the beneficial owner, this isn't about the money, is it?" Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it's not about the money." "Then what is it about?" "Accountability," Jonathan said, "and doing right by people who trusted the wrong person." He paused. "That's not an accusation. It's a description." The room was very quiet. Daniel looked at his hands on the table. "She knew," he said. "It wasn't a question. She knew the whole time, the whole 7 years." Jonathan said nothing. but his silence had the texture of confirmation. "And she never said anything," Daniel continued. "She never told me. She never used it. She just—" He stopped. "She wanted to be known for who she was," Jonathan said quietly. "Not for what she had. I think you understand now why that mattered to her." Daniel looked up. He looked at Jonathan for a long time. "I didn't know her at all," he said. "No," Jonathan said. "You didn't." The meeting ended an hour later without a final agreement. Daniel asked for 2 weeks to review the terms with his full board. Jonathan agreed without pressure. They shook hands again. The attorneys gathered their papers. At the door, Daniel stopped and turned back. "Jonathan," he said. Jonathan looked at him. Is Claire doing well?" Jonathan held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was not unkind, but was not warm either. "Claire is doing exactly what she was always going to do," he said. "She's building something. She's been building it for years. You just weren't in a position to see it." Daniel nodded. He walked out. He rode the elevator down alone and stood in the lobby for a moment before walking out into the November afternoon. The wind off the lake hit him hard the way it does in Chicago in late autumn, and he stood in it for a moment without reaching for his coat collar or looking for his car. He just stood there. Patricia appeared beside him. "Daniel, the terms are genuinely favorable. I think you should seriously consider them." "I know," he said. "You seem—" She paused. "Are you all right?" He looked at the street. "I was married to a woman for 7 years," he said, "and I didn't know who she was. I didn't ask. I didn't look." He exhaled. "I thought I knew everything worth knowing about her. I was wrong about every part of it." Patricia was quiet. "Schedule the board meeting," he said. "Thursday if possible." He walked to his car. The board meeting was not quiet. Daniel had prepared a full presentation. He walked his board through the Arc Bridge proposal with the same methodical precision he had always applied to financial presentations, and he watched the faces around the table shift from skepticism to interest to something approaching disbelief as the terms unfolded. Gerald Morrison, the longest-serving board member, interrupted twice with questions about the equity structure. Patricia answered both. Robert Chow presented the liquidity analysis. The numbers told a story that was uncomfortable but unambiguous. Without a capital solution by February, the covenant pressure on the September bridge loans would trigger a cascade that would be very difficult to manage publicly. "This proposal solves that problem," Robert said. "More than solves it. It gives us runway we don't currently have." "What do we know about the principal?" Gerald Morrison asked. Daniel looked at him steadily. "We know enough," he said. "We know the capital is real, we know the intent is not hostile, and we know the workforce protections are genuine." "That's not a full answer, Daniel." "No," Daniel said. "It's not." He paused. "I have reason to believe the beneficial owner is someone with a personal connection to this company, someone who has a specific interest in ensuring that the people who work here are protected." He looked around the table. "That's not something I'm in a position to fully disclose today, but it's something I'm asking you to trust me on." Gerald Morrison looked at him for a long moment. "That is an unusual ask." "I know. You're asking this board to approve an acquisition structure without knowing who the acquirer is. I'm asking this board to look at the terms and judge them on their merits," Daniel said, "because the terms are extraordinary and because the alternative is worse." The room was quiet. Gerald Morrison looked at Robert Chow. Robert gave a small nod. The vote was 7-2 in favor of proceeding with negotiations. Daniel drove home that evening, feeling something he couldn't immediately name. Not relief, not resolution, something rawer than both, something that felt like the beginning of understanding something you have refused to understand for a very long time, and the particular pain that comes with it. Victoria was at the apartment when he arrived. She had come back 3 days after she left without explanation, and neither of them had fully addressed what had happened at dinner. She was on the phone when he walked in, and she covered the receiver and said, "How did it go?" And he said, "The board approved," and she nodded and went back to her call. He changed his clothes. He went to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of coffee he didn't want and stood at the kitchen counter and thought about Claire standing at the same counter making tea on the morning the divorce papers arrived. He wondered what she had felt. He wondered if she had cried when she was alone. He wondered if she had been relieved the way he had been relieved, or if it had cost her something that she had simply chosen not to show. He realized he didn't know. He realized he had never known. He realized that the entire architecture of his understanding of their marriage had been built on what he assumed she felt, rather than anything she had actually told him, because he had never asked and she had never offered, and between his arrogance and her discretion, there had been 7 years of a marriage that he had been living almost entirely alone. He put the coffee down. He picked up his phone, and for the third time in 2 weeks, he pulled up Claire's contact. Her number was still there. He hadn't deleted it. He told himself it was an oversight. He knew it wasn't. He stared at it. He put the phone away. 2 days later, Jonathan Pierce sent a formal message through the attorneys confirming that the beneficial owner of Arkbridge was prepared to meet personally with Daniel Whitmore at a time and location of his choosing to discuss the final terms of the restructuring agreement and the transition of operational oversight. Daniel read the message 3 times. He picked up his phone and called Patricia Wells. "They want a principal meeting," he said. "I know. I received the same message. How do you want to proceed?" "Set it for next week," he said. "Tell them I'll come to whatever location they choose." "Are you prepared for what this meeting is likely to confirm?" He thought about that question for longer than she expected him to. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." The location they chose was a building on the north side of the city. It had no name on the exterior. The address was not one Daniel recognized. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in December, 2 months after he had signed the divorce papers, 2 months after he had laughed in that conference room, 2 months after Claire Bennett had walked out of a mahogany-paneled room carrying everything Daniel had failed to see. A woman at the front desk took his name and made a call, and then led him to an elevator. The elevator required a key card she was carrying. She pressed the button for the 6th floor without being told which one. The doors opened into a reception area that was quiet and precise and completely without pretension. No artwork chosen for status, no furniture selected for impression. Everything in the room said real work happens here, and we have nothing to prove about it. A young man led Daniel down a corridor and stopped outside a closed door. "Ms. Bennett will be right with you," he said, and then he left. Daniel stood alone outside that door. His heart was doing something he couldn't control. His hands, which he had pressed flat against his thighs to keep still, were not entirely still. I thought about the conference room 8 weeks ago, about the papers hitting the table, about the sound of his own laugh bouncing off those walls and coming back to him now in this corridor, ugly and exposing. The door opened. Claire stood in the doorway. She was not wearing a gray cardigan. She was wearing a dark jacket over a white blouse, and her hair was down, and she looked exactly like herself, he realized. Exactly like the woman he had been married to for 7 years, and completely like someone he had never seen before. She looked at him with those steady, patient eyes. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was exactly the same. "Claire," he said. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." He walked into the office. Jonathan Pierce was seated at a long table along with 2 attorneys and a woman Daniel didn't recognize. Claire took a seat at the head of the table. Not the side, the head. She moved to it naturally, without ceremony, without hesitation, the way you move to a place you have always belonged. Daniel sat across from her, and for the first time since the day he had signed those papers with a laugh and a flourish, he looked at Claire Bennett and saw her clearly. He saw the composure that he had mistaken for passivity. He saw the intelligence that had been operating at full power every single day of their marriage, while he had been telling himself she wasn't particularly interesting. He saw the person who had chosen him, chosen to love him, chosen to build a life with him while carrying a weight of identity and inheritance that most people never carry, and who had asked for nothing in return except to be seen as the person she actually was. He had not given her that. He cleared his throat. "Claire, we should go through the terms first," she said. Not coldly, not with hostility, just with the focused directness of a woman who has learned not to let emotions scatter the work. "There will be time for other things after." He nodded. Jonathan opened the folder, and the meeting began. The terms had not changed from what had been presented at the Langham. They were exactly what they had been. But hearing them now with Claire sitting at the head of the table with the full context of who she was and what she had built occupying every corner of the room, hearing the workforce protections read aloud by Jonathan in his precise voice while Claire sat forward slightly and listened, it hit Daniel differently than it had the first time. The first time he had heard it as a business proposal. Now he heard it as a decision, a considered, deliberate, deeply personal decision made by a woman who had every reason in the world to let his company collapse and its employees scatter and its reputation dissolve, and who had chosen instead to build something that would protect 240 people who had nothing to do with the wrong he had done her. He put his pen down in the middle of the third page of the agreement. Everyone looked at him. "I need to say something," he said, "before we go any further." Claire looked at him across the table. "I'm sorry," he said. The room was completely quiet. "I don't mean about the company. I don't mean about Arkbridge or the terms or any of this." He gestured vaguely at the documents. "I mean about 7 years. I mean about the fact that I spent 7 years next to someone extraordinary and chose to see someone ordinary because it was easier. Because seeing you clearly would have required me to look honestly at myself, and that was something I was not willing to do." He held her gaze. His voice was steady, but only just. "You deserved better than that. You deserved to be seen, and I failed you, completely." Claire looked at him for a long time. Jonathan and the attorneys and the woman Daniel didn't know were all very still. Then Claire said, "I know you're sorry, Daniel." Her voice was quiet. Not forgiving exactly. Not unforgiving either. Something truer than either of those. "I knew who you were when I married you," she said. "I believed you had more in you than you were showing, and maybe you do. That's not for me to determine anymore." She picked up her pen. "What I'm interested in now is what happens next, for the company, for the people who work there, for you in terms of what you choose to do with what comes after this." She looked down at the agreement in front of her. She made a small notation in the margin. "Let's finish the terms," she said. And they did. The agreement was signed that afternoon. All parties, all pages, all conditions intact. When it was done, the attorneys gathered their copies and filed out, and Jonathan rose and excused himself with the tact of a man who understood that the room needed fewer people in it. Daniel and Claire sat across from each other alone for the first time. I didn't know what to say. He had said the important thing, the thing he needed to say. But the silence afterward was enormous, and he sat in it and didn't try to fill it. Claire looked at him across the table, and for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, something moved across her face that wasn't composure or precision or the focused calm of a woman running a meeting. Something that looked like grief, old grief, the kind that doesn't come from today but from years ago, from 1,000 small moments of being unseen. Then it was gone. "I hope you do the work, Daniel," she said. "Not for me, for yourself, so that the next person in your life doesn't have to carry the same thing I carried." He nodded. He couldn't speak. She stood. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it. Her hand was steady. His was not. She picked up her folder and walked to the door and paused with her hand on the frame. "The employees will be contacted this week," she said. "The transition team will be in touch with Robert. Everything will be handled with care." She looked back at him one last time. "That was always the point." She walked out. Daniel sat alone in the room. Outside Chicago moved through its December afternoon, cold and sharp and enormous and completely indifferent to the particular gravity of what had just happened on the 6th floor of a building with no name on it. He sat there for a long time. He thought about the morning he had woken up feeling light, the morning he had decided to end the marriage and felt like a man who had just freed himself. He thought about how certain he had been, how complete his confidence had felt. He thought about what it cost to be that certain about something that wrong. He picked up his copy of the signed agreement. He looked at Claire's signature at the bottom of the last page. Clear, precise, unhurried. Exactly like her. He folded the agreement carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, and he sat with it there for another long moment. Then he stood up. He had a company to help transition. 240 people counting on a process he had helped put in motion, led by a woman who had every reason not to help them and had chosen to anyway. He had a great deal of work to do. He walked to the door. He didn't look back at the room. The signed agreement sat in Daniel's inside jacket pocket for the entire ride back to Whitmore Capital. He didn't take it out. He didn't look at it again. He just felt it there against his chest, the way you feel something heavy that you've decided to carry instead of set down. Robert Chow was waiting for him when he walked off the elevator. "How did it go?" Robert asked. Daniel walked past him toward his office. "Close the door," he said. Robert followed him in and closed the door and stood waiting with the careful attention of a man who has learned that Daniel's moods are weather systems requiring advance reading. Daniel set his briefcase down. He took the agreement out of his jacket and laid it flat on the desk. He smoothed it with both hands, even though it didn't need smoothing. "The deal is signed," he said. Robert exhaled. "Good. That's good, Daniel. The transition team will be in contact with you this week. Everything moves according to the timeline in the agreement." He looked up. "I need you to prepare the all-staff communication. I want every employee to hear about the workforce protections before they hear anything else. Before the financial restructuring, before the equity transition, before any of the business language. The first thing they hear is that their jobs are secure for 3 years." Robert nodded slowly. "I can do that. Do you want to be the one to deliver it?" Daniel thought about that. "Yes," he said. "I want to stand in front of those 240 people myself." "When?" "Friday, before the weekend. I don't want them spending a weekend worrying about something that's already been resolved." Robert picked up his notepad. He started writing. Then he stopped. "Daniel, who is the principal? You can tell me now, right? The deal is signed." Daniel looked at him. "It's Claire," Robert said. Not a question. The way he said it, flat and certain, told Daniel that Robert had known or strongly suspected for some time. "Yes," Daniel said. Robert set his notepad down. He sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited, to which he almost never did. "I should tell you something," he said. "Something I've been sitting on for a while." Daniel looked at him. "About 2 years into your marriage," Robert said carefully. "I ran into Claire at a financial conference, not a social event, a serious institutional finance conference. She was there alone. She was in a session on private trust restructuring that most of the people in that room had spent their careers preparing to understand." He paused. "She saw me, and she smiled, and she said hello, and she asked how the company was doing, and I told her fine, and she said something about one of our investment positions that was so precisely insightful that I stood there for about 30 seconds, not knowing what to say." He looked at Daniel steadily. "I almost called you that evening to ask about it. I decided it wasn't my place." Daniel was very still. "I should have called you," Robert said. "No," Daniel said. "I wouldn't have heard it." He looked at the agreement on his desk. "I wasn't listening to anything that didn't confirm what I already believed." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he stood. "I'll have the draft staff communication to you by tomorrow morning." "Thank you, Robert." Robert walked to the door. He stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "the terms she negotiated for these employees are the most protective I've ever seen in any restructuring. She didn't have to do any of it." "I know," Daniel said. "She chose to," Robert said. "That says something." "It says everything," Daniel said. Robert left. Daniel sat alone in his office for a long time. The December light was already fading outside his window. The city was switching on its evening mode the way it did every day, regardless of what had happened to any particular person on any particular floor of any particular building. I thought about Friday. He thought about standing in front of 240 people and telling them the truth about what had happened and about who had protected them and why. He thought about their faces when they heard it. He thought about what it would mean for him to say it out loud in a room full of people who had trusted him. He had never in his adult life done something he was genuinely afraid of. He picked up his phone. He looked at Claire's contact for the 4th time in 2 months. He put the phone back down. Not yet. He had things to do first. Victoria called him that evening at 8:30. He almost didn't pick up. He picked up on the 4th ring. "I heard the deal is signed," she said. Her voice was measured, professional, the voice she used when she was managing her own emotions with both hands. "Word travels fast. In this city it does." A pause. "Daniel, I need to have an honest conversation with you." "All right. I've been thinking a lot about the last 2 months, about what I said at dinner, about what you said, about the things neither of us said." Her voice shifted slightly. "And I think we both need to acknowledge something." "What's that?" "I pushed you," she said. "I pushed you toward the divorce, not with a gun to your head, but I pushed. I told you Claire was holding you back. I told you that your life would be better, your business would be better, you would be better without her. And I believed it when I said it." She stopped. "I believed it because I wanted it to be true, and that is not the same thing as it actually being true." Daniel sat with that. Victoria. I'm not finished. Her voice was firm. I spent the last several weeks finding out who Claire Bennett actually is. And I have to tell you that the person I dismissed, the person I encouraged you to dismiss, is someone I would have been very differently positioned toward if I had taken 5 minutes to look past what I assumed. She exhaled. I was arrogant. In the specific way that people are arrogant when they believe intelligence and ambition are the same thing as wisdom. They're not. The line was quiet for a moment. What are you telling me? Daniel asked. I'm telling you that I'm stepping back, she said. From us, from the professional overlap, from all of it. Because I think I became part of a story in your life that I didn't fully understand, and I caused damage I didn't intend, and I need to own that. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just said, I think that's honest. It's the most honest I've been in a while, she said. I'm sorry, Daniel. For the part that was mine, she hung up. He set the phone down. I thought about what she had said. I pushed you. He thought about how easy it had been to be pushed, how ready he had been to move in the direction someone else pointed, because it aligned with the story he was already telling himself. He thought about how much of his marriage had been a performance of a belief rather than an actual life, and how Claire had watched all of it with those steady eyes and continued to love him. Anyway, continued to try, continued to believe something better was possible. Until she didn't anymore. He didn't blame Victoria. She had been honest about her part. His part was larger. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. Daniel walked into the all-staff meeting at 9 o'clock. Every employee of Whitmore Capital was in the building that morning. All the floors, all the departments gathered in the main floor conference hall that could barely hold them all. He had asked Robert to ensure everyone was there, including the support staff, the administrative team, the people who worked in the building's lower floors, and rarely interacted with leadership directly. He stood at the front of the room and looked at 240 faces looking back at him. He had prepared remarks. He had spent 2 days writing and revising them with Robert's help. They were clear and professional and covered everything the employees needed to know in the right order. He set the prepared remarks face down on the table in front of him. I'm going to talk to you straight, he said, without the document. The room shifted. People sat forward slightly. Whitmore Capital has been facing financial pressure that I did not communicate to you clearly enough or soon enough. That's on me. Leadership's job is to protect the people in this building from chaos they can't control. And part of that job is honesty about the challenges we face. I was not fully honest. I was managing the message instead of sharing the truth, and you deserved better. No one moved. As of this week, we have entered into a restructuring agreement with a private investment partner. The terms of that agreement guarantee the employment of every person in this room for a minimum of 3 years. No layoffs, no forced reduction of benefits. Independent oversight of senior compensation to ensure that the people at the top don't protect themselves at the expense of the people who actually run this company every day. He looked around the room. Those protections were not my idea. They were insisted upon as primary conditions by the investor, non-negotiable. The deal doesn't happen without them. He heard the sound of the room change, a collective exhale, a shifting of weight. 240 people who had been bracing for bad news and were now trying to recalibrate. A woman in the third row raised her hand. She was a junior analyst named Priya Mehta, who had been with the company for 2 years. Who is the investor? She asked. Daniel looked at her. He had known this question was coming. He had decided on the drive in that morning that he was going to answer it honestly, completely, without the management language and the strategic framing that he would have reached for automatically a year ago. The investor is a woman named Claire Bennett, he said. She was my wife. We divorced 2 months ago. He let that land. He didn't rush past it. She has resources I didn't know about. She has built something extraordinary that I was too careless and too arrogant to see while I was living beside her. She chose, despite everything, to protect the people who work in this building. She had no obligation to do that. She did it because it was right. The room was absolutely silent. I owe her a debt I cannot fully repay, he said. And I owe you all an apology for the months of uncertainty that my poor decisions created. He looked around the room one more time. That's everything. Robert will brief each department on the specific transition details. My door is open for the rest of the day if anyone needs to talk to me directly. He stepped back from the podium. The room was still quiet for a moment. And then Priya Mehta started clapping. Not aggressively, not performatively, just one person who had been afraid and was no longer afraid expressing what that shift felt like. And then the person beside her joined, and then the row behind her. Within 20 seconds, the entire room was applauding, and Daniel stood at the front of it and felt something move through him that he had no clean name for. It wasn't pride. It was something more uncomfortable and more necessary than pride. It was accountability received without punishment. He had not expected that. Across the city, Claire did not know about the all-staff meeting. She was in her own offices working through the first week of transition documentation with Jonathan and the 2 members of the ArcBridge operational team who would be managing the integration. The work was detailed and demanding, and she moved through it with the focused efficiency she always brought to complex problems. At noon, Jonathan set a container of soup on her desk without being asked and said, "Eat." She looked up. She looked at the soup. She picked up the spoon. "How are you actually doing?" Jonathan asked. He sat across from her. "Not operationally, actually." She ate a spoonful of soup before she answered. "I'm all right," she said. "The meeting with Daniel was what it needed to be." "He apologized," Jonathan said. It was an observation, not a question. He had been in the room. "Yes," she said. "Was it enough?" She set the spoon down. She looked at Jonathan the way she always looked at him when he asked her the questions that went below the surface. "It was honest," she said. "And honest is what I always wanted from him. It's just 7 years late." She picked up the spoon again. "But better late than never is a real thing. I believe that." Jonathan nodded. "What does it change for you?" "Nothing," she said. "And everything." She looked at the soup. "It doesn't change the divorce. It doesn't change what we were or weren't to each other. But it means something that he said it. In front of his own reflection, without an audience, with nothing to gain from it." She paused. "Or with everything to gain, just not materially. You think he's capable of becoming someone different?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think he's capable of becoming someone more honest," she said. "Which is the foundation that everything else requires. Whether he actually does it is up to him." Jonathan smiled at that, just slightly. "Your grandmother used to say something very similar." "I know," she said. "I was listening." The transition at Whitmore Capital moved quickly through December and into January. The ArcBridge integration team was efficient and true to the agreement's terms, transparently communicative with both leadership and staff. Robert Chow found himself working more closely with the ArcBridge team than with Daniel in certain periods, and he noticed something in those weeks that he mentioned to Marcus Webb one morning in the break room. "They're not just doing a financial restructuring," he said. "They're rebuilding the governance structure from the foundation, the oversight mechanisms, the reporting structures, the decision-making process. Everything that was personality-driven under Daniel is being systematized." Marcus Webb, who had been keeping his private file for months, nodded slowly. "Is that a problem?" "It's the opposite of a problem," Robert said. "It's what this place always needed and never had." Marcus thought about that for a moment. "You know what strikes me?" he said. "She could have let it fall apart. She could have stood back and watched Daniel's bad decisions catch up with him and collected the wreckage at a fraction of the cost." He stirred his coffee. "She didn't." "No," Robert said. "Why?" Robert looked at him. "Because the 240 people who work here didn't make those bad decisions. Daniel did." He paused. She understood the difference. The first major public acknowledgement of the Bennett Legacy Trust's involvement in the Whitmore Capital restructuring came in mid-January, 3.5 months after the divorce was finalized, when a financial industry newsletter published a brief but precise account of the ArcBridge acquisition, and for the first time in any public document named Claire Bennett as the beneficial principal. The newsletter had a limited readership within the industry, but within that readership the story hit with the force of something much larger. Within 48 hours, 3 major financial publications had picked it up. Within 72 hours, it was on the front page of the business section of 2 national newspapers. The headline in one of them read, "Hidden Heiress Rescues Ex-Husband's Company Protects 240 Jobs." Daniel read it in his office on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee that went cold while he was reading. His phone started ringing at 9 and didn't stop until afternoon. Board members, old colleagues. 2 people he hadn't spoken to in years who suddenly had things they wanted to say. 2 journalists who had gotten his assistant's number somehow. His mother who called 4 times in 90 minutes before he finally picked up. "Daniel Joseph Whitmore," she said. "Mom, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want the truth." Okay. Did you know about Claire? About who she was? He looked at the ceiling of his office. No, Mom, I didn't know. His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then you are the biggest fool in the state of Illinois, she said, and I say that with love. He laughed. It surprised him. A real laugh, the first real one in months. I know, he said. I'm working on it. Victoria called at 11. Her voice was professional and contained. I assume you've seen the coverage. Yes. How are you handling it? One call at a time. The narrative is going to paint you as the villain of this story, she said. You know that. I'm aware. Are you going to do anything to push back on it? I thought about that. He thought about the all-staff meeting, about 240 people whose jobs were secure because of a woman he had dismissed. He thought about the apology in that sixth-floor conference room and the way Claire had received it without softening it and without weaponizing it. He thought about Robert Chow saying she didn't have to do any of it. No, he said. I'm not going to push back on it. A pause. That's probably the right call, Victoria said. Probably, he agreed. She hesitated. For what it's worth, and I understand if it's worth nothing, I think the way you handled the staff meeting was the right thing. I heard about it from someone who was in the room. Thank you. Take care of yourself, Daniel. You too, Victoria. He hung up. The public narrative did unfold the way Victoria had predicted, but it was more complicated than simple villainy. Because the story that emerged in the coverage was not primarily a story of what Daniel had done wrong. It was primarily a story of what Claire had done right, and that distinction mattered enormously. The focus was on the workforce protections, on the quietly extraordinary nature of an heiress who had spent 7 years living without any of the markers of her wealth, who had chosen to be loved for who she was rather than what she had, and who had, in the aftermath of a painful divorce, chosen accountability over destruction and justice over revenge. Several pieces quoted anonymous sources inside Whitmore Capital employees who described the transition team as respectful and communicative in ways they had never experienced from leadership before. One junior employee said in a quote that ran in 2 separate publications, "She didn't know any of us personally, but the way these protections were written, it feels like she did." Claire read the coverage in her office on Friday morning. She read it with the same focused attention she brought to financial documents, noting what was accurate and what was speculative, and what was simply the media's tendency to reduce complex human situations into clean moral narratives. She set the last article down. "They're calling you a hero," Jonathan said from across the room. "I didn't do it to be called anything," she said. "I know." He paused. "Does it bother you, the coverage?" She thought about it honestly. "The parts that are about me don't bother me," she said. "The parts that are about Daniel." She paused. "He's more than what those articles are saying. He's capable of more. I hope he gets the chance to show that." Jonathan looked at her with the quiet admiration of a man who has spent a lifetime watching people respond to difficult situations and has rarely seen it done with this kind of grace. "You know," he said, "your grandmother would have handled this differently." "I know," Claire said. "She would have been cleaner about it, more strategic, less," she searched for the word, "forgiving." "Is that what this is, forgiving?" She was quiet for a moment. "Not exactly," she said. "Forgiving is when you release someone from the consequences of their choices. That's not what this is. He's still living the consequences. He'll be living them for a while." She looked out the window. "What I'm doing is just not adding to the weight unnecessarily. There's already enough weight." "That's a harder thing than revenge," Jonathan said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." The story continued to move through the media cycle in the way that stories do, building for a week, and then diminishing, replaced by other things, other dramas, other moments of human failing and human grace in the enormous ongoing story of the city. But inside Whitmore Capital, something was changing that no article captured. Daniel changed. Not dramatically. Not in the cinematic way that stories sometimes tell it, where a person has one moment of reckoning and emerges fundamentally transformed. Real change doesn't work that way, and Daniel was not a man given to cinema. He changed the way structures change when you remove the thing that was distorting them and let them find their natural position. He started listening. In meetings, instead of arriving with the conclusion already made and using the meeting to confirm it, he started actually listening to what people said. Robert noticed first, then Marcus Webb, then gradually everyone. He started asking questions he had never thought to ask before. Questions about the employees below senior level, about what their day-to-day experience of the company was like, about what they needed that they weren't getting. The answers were sometimes uncomfortable. He sat with the discomfort instead of redirecting it. He started showing up differently. It was not enough to undo 7 years. He understood that. But it was real, and the people around him could feel that it was real. And real has a texture that performed change doesn't have, and they responded to it. In February, 6 weeks into the transition, Daniel did something he had been building toward since the all-staff meeting. He wrote a letter, not a business communication, not a formal document through attorneys. A personal letter, handwritten 3 pages, addressed to Claire Bennett. He wrote it 4 times before he got it right. The first 3 attempts were too much about him, too much about his realization and his growth and what he was learning. He threw those away. The 4th attempt was about her, about what she had done and what it had cost her, and what it meant to him, not as a business proposition, but as a human being looking at another human being, and finally genuinely seeing her. He wrote about the gray cardigan. He wrote about the way she made tea. He wrote about the calls she took in private that he had never asked about, and the trips to Connecticut he had never questioned, and the 1,000 small moments in 7 years when she had been entirely herself and he had been entirely somewhere else. He wrote, "I think the hardest thing I've had to face is not that I didn't know who you were. It's that knowing would have required me to look honestly at who I was, and I was not ready to do that. You deserved someone who was ready. I was not that person. I am trying to become a better version of one. I don't expect anything from you in response to this. I just needed you to know that you are seen, finally and fully, by the person who should have been seeing you all along." He sealed the letter. He addressed it to the Northside office building with no name on the exterior. He mailed it on a Tuesday morning on his way into work. He did not tell anyone about it. He did not wait for a response. He just walked to the post office drop box on the corner, let the letter fall, and kept walking toward the day's work. Claire received the letter on Thursday. She opened it at her desk in the late afternoon when the building had gone quiet. She read all 3 pages without stopping. When she was finished, she set it face down on the desk and looked at the window for a long time. Jonathan came in at 5 o'clock and found her still sitting there. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He noticed the envelope on the desk. He didn't ask. He set a file on the corner of her desk and said, "Whenever you're ready for the February review." "Give me 10 minutes, she said. He left. She picked up the letter again. She read 1 paragraph a second time, the paragraph about the gray cardigan. She read it and held it for a moment, and then she set it down again and held it face down with her palm flat against the back page, like pressing something still. She had not expected to feel anything when she read it. Or she had expected to feel something small and manageable, something she could process and set aside without it costing her anything. She had been wrong about that. It did cost her something, but it was the kind of cost she was willing to pay, the kind that means the thing was real, that it mattered, that the 7 years were not nothing, that the choice to love him had come from the true part of her rather than the strategic part. She picked up her pen. She thought for a long moment. Then she put the pen down. Not yet. There was still one more thing that needed to happen before she wrote back. One more conversation that the story of the last 4 months was building toward. One that neither of them had planned. One that the city itself seemed to be arranging in the way that cities sometimes do when 2 people are circling the same gravity and the distance between them is still exactly as long as it needs to be. She opened the February review file. She got back to work. The letter Daniel sent sat in Claire's desk drawer for 11 days before she did anything about it. She didn't ignore it. She didn't forget it was there. She opened the drawer and looked at it twice, both times in the quiet of late afternoon, when the building had gone still and the day's work was finished, and there was nothing left to hold her attention except the things she had been deliberately not thinking about. On the 12th day, she picked up her phone and called a number she had not called in 4 months. It rang twice. Daniel picked up on the second ring the way people pick up when they have been half expecting a call and are afraid to seem like they have been half expecting it. "Claire," he said. Just her name. Nothing else. The word had a quality to it that she noticed and didn't comment on. "I got your letter," she said. A pause. "I know it was a lot," he said. "You don't have to." "I'm not calling because I have to," she said. "I'm calling because I want to say something to you directly, not through Jonathan, not through attorneys, directly." "Okay," he said. His voice was careful, stripped of the performative confidence that had always been his default register. She noticed that too. The letter was honest, she said. Genuinely. The most honest thing I've heard from you in 7 years, which is a painful thing to say, but it's true. She paused. And I want you to know that I receive it, not as an apology that resolves anything, but as a true thing that a person said when they didn't have to. Daniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. Thank you for saying that. I also want to say something else, she continued. Something I haven't said out loud to anyone, including Jonathan. She looked at the wall in front of her. I loved you. I want you to know that. Because I think you've been telling yourself a story where maybe I didn't, or where my decision to hide my background meant that the whole marriage was somehow strategic or calculated on my side. It wasn't. Her voice held steady. I loved you the way you love someone when you believe in who they could become. That's a real thing. It doesn't stop being real just because the person didn't get there. The silence on the other end of the line was very long. Claire, Daniel said finally, and his voice cracked on the single syllable in a way that she suspected he hadn't intended and couldn't control. I'm sorry, I know I already said it, but I need to say it again. I know, she said. What do we do with all of it? She thought about that question. She had been thinking about it for 4 months. We do what people do, she said. We go forward. We do better with what we know now. We don't let it be wasted. Is there any version of forward that includes... He stopped himself. I'm sorry, I don't have the right to ask that. No, she said gently. You don't. Not right now. She paused. But you have the right to keep becoming the person you're becoming, and that matters more than you know. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she put it down and went back to work. March arrived, and with it the first full quarterly review under the ArcBridge governance structure. Claire attended in person at Whitmore Capital's conference hall, which was the first time she had been inside the building since she had left it 7 years ago, as Daniel's wife going home in a taxi on a Tuesday evening after having dinner with one of his clients. She remembered that evening suddenly as she walked through the lobby. She remembered the dinner and the client and the way Daniel had talked all the way through it and barely noticed whether she had said anything. She had sat with her wine and watched the lake out the restaurant window and thought another year, give it another year. She had given it 3 more after that. She pushed the memory aside and walked to the elevator. The conference hall was full. She recognized Robert Chow and Marcus Webb near the front. She recognized Priya Mehta, the junior analyst who had asked who the investor was at the all-staff meeting, and started the applause sitting in the 3rd row again, in the same seat with the same posture of engaged attention. She did not immediately see Daniel. She was about to take a seat when she heard his voice behind her. Claire. She turned around. I was standing 6 feet away in a charcoal jacket that she recognized he had worn it to their anniversary dinner 3 years ago, and he looked like himself fundamentally, but also like a version of himself that had been through something and had the evidence of it in the lines around his eyes and the way he held his shoulders slightly less performed than they used to be. Daniel, she said. He walked toward her and stopped at a respectful distance. I didn't know you were going to be here in person. Jonathan thought it was important for me to be visible at the first full review, she said. He was right. He usually is, Daniel said. I've learned that about him. She looked at him carefully. He looked back at her with an openness that was new. Not absence of armor exactly, but a different kind of armor. One built from honesty rather than confidence, which is a harder thing to build and a much stronger one. You look well, she said. You look like yourself, he said. That's a compliment. I mean it as the highest one I know how to give now. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you. They stood for another second, and then the room was moving and people were taking seats, and Jonathan appeared at Claire's elbow with a folder and said, We're ready when you are, and the moment passed into the ordinary motion of the day. But something had shifted. Something had been set down and acknowledged without being made into more than it was, and that Claire knew was its own kind of progress, not dramatic, not resolved, but real. The quarterly review ran for 3 hours. Claire sat at the head of the table. Daniel sat 2 seats to her left, which was his position as the remaining senior executive of the company under the new governance structure. He had agreed as part of the restructuring terms to a defined operational role with clear accountabilities and a board that had genuine oversight authority. He had agreed without fighting any of it. The numbers were better, not dramatically better. 3 months of new governance didn't rewrite years of decisions, but structurally better. The foundation was cleaner. The decision-making was more transparent. The debt positions were being managed on schedule. Robert Chow presented the employee satisfaction metrics, which were a new addition to the quarterly review structure that the ArcBridge team had insisted on. They were for an organization that had just gone through a restructuring surprisingly high. 83% of employees rated their confidence in company stability as significantly improved from the previous quarter. 79% said they felt more respected by leadership than they had 6 months prior. Priya Mehta had organized a small, informal working group from the junior staff that had submitted a proposal for a mentorship program. Robert presented it at the end of the financial section as a bonus item. Claire read through the one-page summary and looked up at Robert. "Fund it," she said. Daniel looked at her. "It's $20,000 for the first year," she said. "Fund it, support it formally, and ask Priya's group to present a 6-month progress report at the next quarterly." She set the page down. "When young people take initiative, you meet them." The room was quiet for a moment. Daniel looked at the one-page proposal in front of him and thought about every time in the last 7 years someone had brought him an initiative, and he had said he'd consider it and never followed up. He thought about all the Priya Mehtas he had failed to meet. He picked up his pen and made a note. After the review, as people were filing out, Priya Mehta approached Claire with the nervous directness of someone who has decided to do something brave and is committed to following through even though their hands are shaking. "Ms. Bennett," she said. Claire turned. "Priya." Priya blinked. "You know my name." "I read the all-staff briefing documents when I came on board," Claire said. "You were cited for something in Q3. I don't remember what specifically. Something accurate and useful that you said in a meeting." Priya stared at her for a moment. "Thank you for funding the mentorship program," she said. "We weren't sure anyone would take it seriously." "I take seriously the people who take their own ideas seriously," Claire said. "That's not charity. That's basic management philosophy." Priya nodded. She started to turn away and then turned back. "Can I ask you something you don't have to answer?" "Go ahead." "The workforce protections, the 3-year guarantee, the independent oversight." She paused. "You could have let this place collapse and bought what was left for less. Why didn't you?" Claire looked at her for a moment. "Because the company was a bad decision made by one person," she said. "You are not one person's bad decision. None of the people in this building are." She paused. "The way a structure fails should not be the thing that determines whether the people inside it survive. That's all." Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who has just heard a thing that is going to stay with them for a very long time. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for more than just the mentorship program, and they both knew it. Claire nodded. She watched Priya walk away. Daniel was standing near the door. She hadn't noticed him there. He had heard the exchange. His face had the quality it got now when something landed in him that he was still learning to process openly rather than burying under motion. "That was the right thing to say," he said. "It was the true thing," she said, "which is the same as right usually." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She walked out. April came and the Bennett Legacy Trust held its annual governance meeting in Connecticut at the estate where Claire had grown up and where her grandmother still lived, sharp and formidable at 84 years old, in a chair by the window with reading glasses and a stack of financial briefings that she worked through with the same focused attention she had brought to everything for 6 decades. Claire arrived on a Thursday evening. Her grandmother looked up when she walked in and said, "You look different." Claire sat down across from her. "Different how?" Eleanor Bennett removed her reading glasses and looked at her granddaughter with the direct, assessing gaze that had made people in boardrooms feel simultaneously seen and weighed for 50 years. "Lighter," she said. "The way you look after you've set something heavy down." Claire thought about that. "The Whitmore situation is resolved," she said. "The transition is on track. The employees are protected." "I wasn't asking about the transaction," Eleanor said. Claire met her grandmother's eyes. "You loved him," Eleanor said, not a question. "I knew that when you called me 4 months ago and told me the divorce was filed, you didn't cry. That meant it was the kind of loss you'd been carrying for a long time." Claire looked at her hands. "I loved who I believed he could be," she said, "which may not be the same thing." "It never is," Eleanor said. Not at the beginning. Love is always partly a bet on potential. She set her glasses down. The question is not whether you loved him. The question is what you did with the loss. I tried to do something useful with it, Claire said. Eleanor nodded slowly. And the man himself? He's changing, Claire said. I think it's real. I can't be certain, but it has the texture of real. Will you? No, Claire said. Not harshly, just clearly. That's not where this goes. What happened between us is over. What comes next for him is his to build. She looked at her grandmother steadily. I'm not his teacher. I'm not his second chance. I'm someone who loved him and was not seen by him and then chose to do something decent in the aftermath. That's the whole story. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Your mother would have been very proud of you. Claire felt the weight of that land exactly where her grandmother intended it to land, in the deep place, the place that had nothing to do with business or strategy or the Bennett Legacy Trust, and everything to do with a 9-year-old girl who lost her parents in October and was raised by a woman who taught her that grief was not weakness and strength was not the absence of feeling. Thank you, she said. Her voice held. Eleanor picked up her reading glasses. Now, walk me through the Whitmore transition in detail. I want the actual numbers. Claire smiled. She reached for her folder. Some things never changed, and some of them you were grateful for. The Bennett Legacy Trust's annual governance meeting lasted 3 days. Claire presented the full ArcBridge integration report, the workforce metrics, the financial projections, and the governance structure changes that were already being studied by 2 academic institutions as a model for ethical restructuring. On the second day, Jonathan stood at the front of the conference room and presented something that Claire had not been expecting. He presented a proposal, his own, developed over the past 3 months in consultation with the Trust's advisory board, without telling Claire, which was unusual enough that she sat forward in her chair the moment she recognized what she was looking at. The Bennett Legacy Community Initiative, Jonathan said. A structured allocation from the Trust's annual operating income toward workforce protection community, employment and institutional accountability programs in 3 cities, initially scaling to 12 within 5 years. He set the first page down. This is what I believe the Trust should be doing with its position in this moment. Not just managing wealth, building something that the wealth makes possible. Claire looked at the proposal in front of her. She turned pages slowly. Jonathan looked at her from the front of the room. I know you didn't ask for this, he said. I built it anyway because it's what you've been thinking about for years, and I know it, and it's time. The room was quiet. Claire looked up from the proposal. How long did this take you? About 8 months, he said. I started it around the time the divorce papers were filed. She looked at him for a long moment. You built this because of what happened with Daniel. I built this because of what you did with what happened with Daniel, he said. There's a difference. She looked back at the proposal. She turned 3 more pages. The details were precise and exactly right. The way everything Jonathan built was precise and exactly right, with the moral architecture as carefully constructed as the financial one. All in favor, she said. Every hand in the room went up. In May, the Bennett Legacy Community Initiative made its first public announcement. It was not a press conference. There was no prepared statement read from a podium. Claire sat down for one interview with one journalist from a publication she respected, and she answered 12 questions directly and without management, and the resulting piece ran under a headline that she had not written and had not approved in advance, but that she read once and set aside without objection. The headline read, "The Heiress Who Chose People Over Power." She did not think that was quite right, but she understood why it was written that way, and she understood that the story had to be told in the language available to it, and the story was close enough to true that she could live with it. The 12th question the journalist asked her was, "What do you want people to take from what you did?" She thought about it for a long time before she answered. "I want people to understand that humility is not the same as weakness," she said, "and silence is not the same as submission, and patience is not the same as passivity." She looked at the journalist steadily. "Some of the most powerful things I have ever done were things nobody saw while I was doing them. That was deliberate, not because I was hiding, because I understood that the loudest version of power is almost never the most effective one." She paused. "And I want people to understand that you can choose what to do with the hardest things that happen to you. You are not obligated to destroy in proportion to how you were hurt. You can build instead. It is harder. It is slower. It costs more in ways that don't show up in any accounting system. She held the journalist's gaze. But what you build is real, and real lasts. The piece ran on a Friday morning in the second week of May. By that afternoon, it had been shared more times than the publication's editorial team had seen in 3 years. By that evening, Robert Chow had forwarded it to everyone at Whitmore Capital, with no message attached, except 3 words, "This is why." Priya Mehta read it at her desk and sat with it for a long time and then sent it to her mother without any explanation, because some things you just need someone who loves you to hold with you. Daniel read it twice. He read it the second time slowly, the way you read something when the first read shook you and you need the second one to make sure you understood it correctly. He did not call Claire. He did not send another letter. He had said what he needed to say, and she had heard it and responded with something that was exactly as much as the moment warranted, and not 1 degree more. He understood finally that receiving that gracefully was the best thing he could do. He printed the article. He put it in the same drawer where he kept the restructuring agreement. He closed the drawer. He went to his next meeting. He listened. He asked questions. He did the work. In June, 4 months after the quarterly review, where he had first seen her in that building, Daniel passed Claire in the lobby of Whitmore Capital on a morning when she was arriving for a governance check-in and he was leaving for an external meeting. They nearly missed each other. He was looking at his phone. She was talking to Jonathan. He looked up at exactly the right moment. They made eye contact for 3 seconds in the lobby of the building that she now co-governed, and that he was still learning to lead differently. He nodded. She nodded back. No words, no performance, just 2 people who had been through something enormous together, standing briefly in the same space and acknowledging each other as what they actually were. 2 separate people with separate futures connected by a history that had cost them both something real and produced something in the end that neither of them had entirely expected. He walked out. She walked to the elevator. Jonathan, who had seen the exchange, said nothing. He didn't need to. By summer, the Bennett Legacy Community Initiative had completed its first full operational quarter in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Detroit. The Chicago program alone had supported employment protections for over 800 workers across 4 companies that were facing pressures similar to the ones Whitmore Capital had faced. The methodology was the same one Claire had applied, stabilizing capital workforce protections as primary conditions, governance restructuring built on transparency and accountability. It was being called in certain circles the Bennett model. Claire had not named it that. She hadn't named it anything. She was too busy running it to spend time on what people called it. Eleanor Bennett read about it in the Connecticut estate and said nothing for 3 days, and then called Claire on a Tuesday evening and said, "Your grandfather built this trust because he believed that wealth was only meaningful if it was used for something beyond itself. I think you finally understand what he meant." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I think I've understood it for a while," she said. "I just needed the circumstances to do something about it." "Most people who understand things never act on them," Eleanor said. "That is the whole difference." They talked for another hour. About the initiative, about the next phase, about 2 cities they were considering adding to the program. Eleanor asked the right questions, the sharp ones, the ones Claire was still working through answers for. When the call ended, Claire sat in her apartment in the north side of Chicago, a different apartment than the penthouse she had shared with Daniel, smaller, warmer, with books she had chosen herself on every available surface, and she felt the particular quality of evenings that have nothing pressing left in them. She was 36 years old. She was not a woman defined by a divorce. She was not a woman defined by a fortune. She was not a woman defined by what anyone had failed to see in her or what anyone had eventually recognized. She was a woman defined by what she chose to do with the life she had been given and the losses she had survived and the power she had carried quietly for years and was now using in the open with both hands. She picked up a book. She made tea. She sat in the chair by the window. Outside Chicago moved through its summer evening the way it always did, enormous and indifferent and magnificent. The lake wind coming in from the east, the city lights asserting themselves against the settling dark. She turned a page. She was not waiting for anyone. She was not proving anything to anyone. She was simply here in the life she had built, doing the work that mattered, becoming more fully herself with every choice she made and everything she refused to let diminish her. That was the whole story, not the divorce, Not the fortune, not the restructuring or the legal documents or the headlines or the man who had finally too late learned to see her. The whole story was this: a woman who knew her own worth long before anyone else did, who waited with patience that looked like passivity and moved with precision that looked like stillness, who chose justice over revenge and building over burning, who protected 240 people who never knew her name until the day they needed her, who showed the world without announcing it that real power has nothing to prove and everything to offer. And when it finally spoke, the whole city listened.